This is my first presentation in a series that I'm going to do on New England OA chapter issues. This is a follow-up to the Lodge Sleepers and Showstoppers presentations that I did a year ago, almost exactly. And a lot of the sleepers in some of those lodges are from chapters, just because chapters are even smaller than the lodges, and their issues tend to be in much smaller quantities and are generally pretty scarce. So, and I'm going through my chapter collection, and it's going to be more parts than I originally thought, but we'll start out here. So just my background: Roy Wetherbee. My email is packachog@gmail.com. I was a Blue Book regional editor for the volumes 1 through 6, spanning 1996 to 2006. I was an ASTA area VP, Northeast Region VP, and then when ASTA got rolled into ISCA, I was the Northeast Region VP for the first 10 years. I'm a past lodge advisor at Packachog Lodge 525 here in Massachusetts. And I'm currently advancement chairman for Troop 114 Shrewsbury, which is my son's troop. It's kind of a mega troop. We're at 87 right now. So I've been collecting since 1977 when I attended my first jamboree, which was actually the 1977 Canadian Jamboree. And that's where I caught the patch trading bug. And then I've been focused on collecting New England OA since 1987, thanks to a book published by Rob Cutts, who's also on the call. So again, this is a follow-up to the 6-part series that I did last year. This is just a quick overview of what that was. Since many of the sleeper issues mentioned in these presentations were chapters, I thought I'd go deeper on some of the OA chapter issues. So I'm going to start out with Connecticut, and currently Connecticut is 4 lodges, and I'm starting with the Northeastern Connecticut for a number of reasons, mainly because they have the most chapter issues of any other, currently active council or lodge in the region. So Shitani Lodge 10 was originally chartered in 1996 by the merger of Secaucus Lodge 10 and Eluwak Lodge 59. Secaucus Lodge was itself formed by the merger of Uncas Lodge 297 and Samsonacum Lodge 388. And to the best of my knowledge, none of those lodges, Secaucus, Uncas, or Samsonacum, ever issued any sort of chapter patch or item. So we'll be focusing the Northeastern Connecticut presentations on Eluwak Lodge 59. They chartered in 1973, and they did merge into Shitani in 1995. Eluwak itself was formed by the merger of 5 lodges in 1972, Kiatan Lodge 59, Mattatuck Lodge 217, Wahungan Lodge 234, Tunxus Lodge 491, and Wapunkwik Lodge 558. And what we'll see is it was a very fractured merger. I think we discussed this before. Kiatan Lodge just became Kiatan chapter. Mattatuck Lodge became Mattatuck chapter. Tunxus Lodge became Tunxus chapter. Wapunkwik Lodge became Wapunkwik chapter. And it looks like Wahungan Lodge actually split into 2 chapters. So there was a Kemosabe chapter, Kemosabe being one of Wahungan's predecessor lodges, and then there was a Kachipiani chapter that was based out of Camp Kachipiani. And then it seems in like the 76, 77 time frame that there was a bit of a shakeup, and new chapters were formed as well. So there was Kudawitu chapter, Metacomet chapter, Nutmeg chapter, and El Jixin chapter. And I'm going to focus on these early chapters first, and I'm going to save most of Kiatan chapter for the next presentation, just because they had a ton of stuff. So again, you can see the lodges went straight to chapters. The Kiatan Lodge, which was a 2 per life flap, difficult name, if anyone collects those, became Khitan chapter. The twill Khitan chapter flap is seriously just as scarce as any Khitan F1 out there. Very difficult to find this flap, very difficult to find it in mint condition, because these Khitan Lodge members sewed their Khitan chapter flaps on, and they wore them for years to everything. I remember seeing them at conclaves. Tunxis Lodge did the same thing. Tunxis Lodge simply became Tunxis chapter. They kept their same flap. They did update the number. You notice there is no number on the Khitan chapter flap, but Tunxis kept the 59, but all things stayed the same. And then Wapunkwik chapter, which was in the center of the state, simply kept their flap, changed the council name, changed the number, and that was that. It's interesting. This was the subject of quite a bit of conversation a week or two ago on Facebook, because it's easily confused. It says Wapunkwik 59, almost implies, I mean, it's obviously chapter, but it doesn't say chapter. So it's easily confused with the lodge issue. And then the other chapters. So Wapunkwik, we already saw they stuck with the flap, but they also went with the same neckerchief patch. They went from Wapunkwik Lodge to Wapunkwik chapter. And then Mattatuck Lodge, same thing. They kept their design, they kept their name, and they went to a chapter. So clearly 5 lodges didn't, in the short term, become one lodge. A lot of fragmentation there. And then we saw in the later 70s that there was some reorganization and probably a little bit of, chapter busting and clique busting involved. I'm going to look at these chapters in reverse order here. And Mattatuck chapter is pretty easy to cover because these are the only 2 chapter patches that they've issued. They have this design based on their R1, R2, R3 from the old lodge. And then they did do a 50th anniversary of the lodge patch in 1992. And if you get those 2 patches, you've got that entire chapter. Now, Wapunkwik, you have the flap, and then they did issue the neckerchief patch on a neckerchief with black piping. And then in the early days, the first order was a mistake. So instead of Wapunkwik chapter, they had Wapunkwik Lodge 59, Eluwak Lodge. And they corrected this by reissuing a corrected version that said Wapunkwik chapter, Eluwak Lodge 59. These patches, the error is no rarer than the reissued patch here. They both seem to be equally common. And then the only other Wapunkwik patch, again, that we're aware of was this Wapunkwik, doesn't say chapter, but Wapunkwik chapter of Eluwak Lodge 59 had this spring fellowship patch. And the embroidery, it's kind of a stock design from the middle to late 70s. So this was probably issued probably about the time they were kind of reorganizing again, maybe 77, 76, 77, 78 in that time frame. So that's the only other issue, and it's the only event patch that they issued here. And then again, back to Tunxis chapter, that's all they had. They had their one flap. And again, I think this chapter went away in that reorganization that happened around 1977. So the chapter flap is, it's not common, but it's not nearly as rare as the Khitan flap that they had issued. So this is around. And then we have Kemosabe chapter. And here's another chapter where they didn't issue a lot of things. So for Kemosabe chapter, I'm only aware of this 25th anniversary neckerchief and this Kemosabe chapter patch, which does at least say Eluwak 59 on it. this neckerchief has, no other indication. When this first appeared, we weren't even sure if it was the Kemosabe chapter in Connecticut or, whether it was from somewhere else. And then, we were able to find people in Connecticut that were able to confirm that this was issued by that Kemosabe chapter. Not terribly common, either of these. The patches really dried up in recent years. You don't see this around very much at all. And then we have Kachipiani chapter. And I believe the first thing that they issued here for the chapter was this neckerchief. It was apparently run a couple of times because there were varieties with a light yellow or darker yellow piping, a lighter yellow and darker yellow silkscreen, and a tiny half shade difference in the blue. So there are a couple of varieties of this neckerchief that were issued by that chapter. Again, not very common. And then they had a Boy Power Orama in 1975, Kachipiani OA. Again, if you know that there's a Kachipiani chapter, you can tell that this is a chapter issued piece. And then in 76, they had this Boy Power Manpower neckerchief slide, issued by the chapter as well. And 1976 here is, again, approaching that 1977 timeframe when all these chapters got kind of bounced around and mixed up. But I think this one survived a bit longer than that, because the next patch, is designed like this. And this is computer designed, actually kind of Asian, probably Howardson, actually, sort of patch. I have a couple here because they were made, in that Chinese style where no two are exactly alike. You can see that there are differences in the lettering and things like that. And I don't believe they were separate runs. I think the patches were just made in that Asian style where every patch is a little different from another. So I keep a couple of different specimens here in my collection just to remind me of that difference. This was kind of a short one because I wanted to kind of summarize and get through some of those smaller chapters with their low number issues before I dive into the next couple of chapters. I've got a 2-gallon bag of chapter patches from these other chapters. So they're taking a while to scan and color correct and drop in. I've been pretty lucky with my chapter patch collecting. Bought a couple major collections that helped fill in a lot of the really tough needs. But at a traderie just a couple months ago, I found several chapter pieces, a couple of neckerchiefs, a belt buckle, a keychain, a challenge coin, all dating to the 70s. And so here we have chapter issues issued in the 1970s, 78, 79, that were not discovered until a couple of months ago. So this stuff can be super obscure, and but it's still out there and it's still being discovered. As far as I know at this point in time, my only chapter need from Connecticut is this pin, issued in 1982. And the odd thing is that I actually own the pin die pattern from the Howardson factory from which this pin was made. I just haven't tracked down this pin yet. So if anyone ever happens across it, I'm very interested, simply because it's the last one I know of.
Beautiful.
And that's it. I mean, next time I'll do Khitan chapter, which is the last of those 5 original chapters or 6 original chapters. And then I'm going to dive into Eljikson chapter, which literally just has, there's like a gallon bag of each of chapter patches for these 2 chapters. And then in my third presentation, I'll just cover the rest of Connecticut. And at that point, I can do all of the rest of New England in one presentation, because Connecticut has like 2/3 of all the chapter issues ever issued in New England.
Mike Clark said, Roy, there was a district alignment.
70s. So that, that totally makes sense, because there were a bunch of new chapters that appeared in 1971, in 1976 for sure, and several others in 1977. So, and the chapters generally aligned with either a camp or a district.
Right about that time, I went up to visit a good buddy in the lodge. The lodge only had 2 functions a year, a banquet and a weekend. I went up to visit the weekend. It was their vigil weekend, except the vigils weren't chosen by the lodge. Apparently, they gave each of the chapters a quota, and the chapters were able to submit vigil nominees. Sitting at the Cracker Barrel that night, it's a pretty good one. And I spoke to one of the guys who've been called out for vigil. I said, "Are all the Cracker Barrels this good?" He said, "I don't know. This is the first lodge function I've ever been to."
Well, Rob Cutts was in that lodge.
Yeah, I was a member of Wapunkwak Lodge, and then when the merger happened, of course, became a charter member of Eluwak Lodge. And it really, Roy used the word fractured. I would say acrimonious merger. This was forced upon the councils, and none of them really wanted to merge. And they all kept their camps, and they all kept their, all the lodges became chapters, as you saw. They issued flaps, just like you saw. Virtually all of them just retained their original identity. Wapunkwak was the largest of all of the lodges in the merger, and we had 2 chapters at the time of the merger, an East and a West chapter. And the East and West chapters didn't even meet. We had spring and fall ordeals for each one of those 2 chapters. And after the merger, all of the chapters did their own ordeals. And the only real lodge event was the lodge banquet. And I never attended a lodge event in the time that I was in the lodge, because the years that I was in the lodge, 73 through 77, were the years I was at the Coast Guard Academy, and I could only get away every once in a while. And so I used my weekends to go to the chapter events in the spring and the fall, Lake of Isles. And that's actually how I finally made Vigil, because they didn't like traders. Wapunkwak had been a 2 per life, no trade, 1 at Ordeal, 1 at Brotherhood lodge. And the initial 2 lodge flaps of Eluwak had a restriction on them, and they did not like traders. But because I took my little precious free time away from the Coast Guard Academy to come to the ordeals, I finally got made Vigil. And I'm virtually certain that what Rick said was true, was that my Vigil came through my chapter, which was, of course, the Wapunkwak chapter. And Mike Clark talking about the district realignment in 76, 77. I never knew why they changed all the chapters around, because I had graduated by the May of 77. But my chapter, which was Wapunkwak chapter, split. And that wasn't even a happy time. We became Nutmeg chapter, and Nutmeg chapter met at Camp Workomen, and we held exactly 1 event, which was Fall Fellowship in 1977. And then Nutmeg chapter went away in that reorganization, because Wapunkwak had split, and we had this, I don't know, rogue chapter, I guess, called Nutmeg chapter. So it's interesting times.
When my buddy went out there, like a good boy who went to his new chapter's ordeal, not until after he was at that ordeal did he learn that the lodge banquet was down the road at another scout camp. So he bugged out to go to the lodge banquet, since he only just then heard of it.
I believe it. They sold off camps, and how it goes when they sell off camps. Some of those camps are still around because there were threats. Roy talks this about being Northeastern Connecticut, and that's really not what it is, because Eluwak Lodge went from all the way at the western border of Connecticut all the way to the eastern border of Connecticut. Once they became Shawnee, I should say. They only went to about 2/3 of the way across the state from the western border when they were Eluwak. But then when they merged with Secaucus Lodge, they picked up the whole eastern, maybe 1/4 of the state. So the lodge really encompasses the vast majority of the state of Connecticut, and the other 3 lodges are very small, both geographically and size-wise, but they're also wealthier because the wealth in Connecticut is in the Southwest. So Greenwich Council has Atchewonatopolis Lodge, which is basically a 1-city council, has tons of money. Pagasset Lodge is 5 towns, has in Derby, out of Derby, Connecticut, lots of money. And Connecticut Yankee Council is the rest of southwestern Connecticut, which is really all a suburb of the metropolis of New York City. So that's where the money is.